The emergency klaxons had been screaming inside the Galactic Council's orbital chamber for 11 minutes when Counselor Dravith of the Usorin Collective finally slammed his three-fingered hand on the silence panel. The noise died. What replaced it was somehow worse: the sound of 200 alien diplomats, generals, and advisors breathing in collective dread. The holographic battle map at the center of the chamber told the story with brutal simplicity. Blue markers, council ships, were being pushed back across the Velari frontier like dust swept off a table. Red markers, Kreth Dominion warships, advanced in the kind of disciplined, merciless formation that only came from a species that had spent 4 centuries doing nothing but making war. The numbers were ugly. 31 council vessels against 94 Kreth destroyers and 11 capital ships. The math didn't require a supercomputer. "We are looking at the complete collapse of the frontier within the hour," said Fleet Admiral Sunvara of the Velari, her voice stripped of everything except the bare facts. Her species, the Velari, were the ones who lived on the other side of that frontier. Tall, silver-skinned, with large, luminous eyes built for deep space observation, they were scientists and explorers, not warriors. They had relied on the Council's protection for 60 years. Right now, that protection was evaporating in real time. "Evacuation corridors," someone asked. "Compromised. The Kreth have deployed FTL inhibitors along the outer belt. Colony transports cannot jump. They are moving at subluminal speed with Kreth pursuit vessels closing." Sunvara pulled up the specific feed. A cluster of large, slow civilian ships, 12 of them, carrying somewhere between 80 and 100,000 souls, were crawling through open space, while 3 Kreth destroyers angled toward them like sharks smelling blood in water. The chamber descended into noise again. 40 different species shouting in 40 different languages, their translator implants turning it all into an overwhelming wall of overlapping arguments. Some demanded immediate ceasefire negotiations. Others wanted to authorize the use of the Council's reserve fleet, currently stationed 3 hours away at Juncture Station. A Helvari general was already drafting a formal surrender proposal on the grounds that it would minimize casualties. A Driathi elder named Sorvon sat very still in his elevated chair, saying nothing, watching the battle map with his 4 dark eyes like a man reading a book he had read before. It was the sensor operator, a young Velari woman named Vis, who saw it first. She didn't shout. She didn't have the voice for it. She simply said, very quietly, "There is a new contact on the board," and something in her tone cut through every argument in the room like a blade through silk. Everyone turned. On the battle map, a single new marker had appeared. It had dropped out of FTL without warning, without a corridor reservation, without a council flight plan, without so much as a courtesy ping to traffic control. It had materialized directly inside the battle zone, not on the edges, not at a safe observational distance, but right in the middle of the engagement, between the Kreth destroyers and the colony transports. It seemed to have specifically chosen as a destination. The marker was not blue, it was not red. The system had tagged it white, which meant unknown. "Hull configuration?" Admiral Sunvara asked. Vis pulled up the visual feed. The ship was roughly similar in size to a Council heavy cruiser, perhaps 400 meters bow to stern, with an angular, utilitarian design that suggested it had been built by engineers who cared a great deal about function, and almost nothing about aesthetics. Its hull was dark gray, scarred in several places with what looked like old battle damage that had been repaired but not cosmetically restored. It carried weapons, visible railgun arrays, missile tubes, what looked like a pair of heavy particle lances, but they were not currently active. "I don't recognize the configuration," Sunvara said slowly. "I do." The voice came from the far end of the chamber. It was Ambassador Thesivar, the Velari civilian representative, not a military officer, a diplomat, and she had gone so pale that her silver skin had turned almost white. She was staring at the marker on the board with an expression that nobody in the room could quite interpret. It wasn't fear. It wasn't relief. It was something more complicated than both. "Those hull markings," she said. "That configuration, I've seen the database files." She swallowed. "That is a human ship." The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened in the chamber all day. Sorvan, the Drayathi historian who had not moved or spoken in 40 minutes, slowly reached forward and pulled Humanity's file up on his personal screen. He had read it before. Most council historians had humanity was a curiosity, a young species barely 2 centuries into serious interstellar activity, largely self-contained, not particularly notable by any standard metric. He opened the file again now, while everyone else in the room scrambled to understand what a human warship was doing here. The first page loaded. Sorvan read the summary he had read before, and then, very slowly, he began to scroll deeper into the file than he had ever gone before, past the diplomatic summaries and the trade records and the exploration logs, into the older sections, the historical records that predated humanity's contact with the wider galaxy. He read for a long time while chaos raged around him. When he finally looked up, his 4 eyes were very still, and his mandibles had drawn tight against his jaw in the particular way that, for Drayathi, indicated not fear but something older and more primal. Recognition. The hailing frequency opened with a tone that the Council's communication systems flagged as civilian band, not military protocol, not an emergency broadcast, just a standard open channel, the kind used for routine traffic coordination. As if the human vessel had pulled up alongside a docking port and was asking permission to park. The voice that came through was a woman's, calm, professional. The translator rendered it in clean, unaccented standard, and what struck every person in the council chamber who heard it was not what she said, it was what was absent from how she said it. No tension. No elevated heart rate audible in the breath patterns. No micro-tremors in the vocal cords that universal translator algorithms were designed to detect and flag as stress indicators. Kreth Fleet Commander, this is Captain Yara Ose of the United Earth ship Relentless Accord, operating under Terran Deep Patrol mandate. I am speaking to you directly because I believe in clarity. A brief pause. You have 60 seconds to reverse course and withdraw your vessels from the colony transport corridor. I will not repeat this request. In the council chamber, someone actually laughed. A short, disbelieving bark from a Helvari admiral who covered his mouth immediately, embarrassed by it. Because the Relentless Accord was one ship, against 3 Kreth destroyers that were each individually outmassing it by a factor of 2, backed by a fleet of over 100 vessels within support range. The math was so absurd that the laughter was almost reasonable. On the battle feed, the 60 seconds ticked by. The Kreth destroyers did not reverse course. Captain Ose did not repeat herself. The Relentless Accord moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes became the most analyzed piece of combat footage in Council military history for the next 3 decades. Not because of the outcome, though the outcome was remarkable enough, but because of the methodology. Council warships fought in established doctrinal patterns, optimized over centuries of interstellar warfare, built around the principle of minimizing damage to one's own assets while maximizing it to the enemy. Clean, calculated, logical. The Relentless Accord did not fight like that. It fought like something that had decided the space between itself and the enemy was an inconvenience to be removed as quickly as possible. It closed distance at a rate that made the Kreth destroyers' targeting systems hesitate, because nothing was supposed to want to be that close to 3 hostile warships. Its point defense grid lit up in a continuous curtain of fire, shredding incoming missiles not at maximum range, but at close range, deliberately letting them get near before killing them, because that freed its longer-range weapons to focus entirely on offensive targeting rather than splitting priorities. The first Kreth destroyer lost its primary drive column 43 seconds into the engagement. Not from a lucky hit, from a precise sequence of 3 shots that struck the exact same structural junction from 3 different angles in under 2 seconds. a firing solution that required the human ship's combat AI and its crew to be operating in a level of synchronized coordination that the Council's analysts, watching the feed, initially assumed had to be automated. It wasn't. Post-battle data would later confirm that Captain Ose had personally called that firing sequence from the command deck with verbal orders. How is she calculating those solutions in real time? A Velari tactical officer breathed, watching the feed. Nobody answered because nobody knew. In the chamber, Sorvan was still reading. He had found the section of humanities file marked Historical Military ENGAGMNTS and had begun working through it with the focused intensity of a scholar who has just realized the book he is reading is far more important than he initially thought. The entries were incomprehensible in their volume. Thousands of conflicts, hundreds of major wars. A species that had, for the majority of its recorded history, been fighting someone, and that someone had almost always been itself. He read about a place called Stalingrad. He read about something called the Eastern Front. He read about a battle in a Pacific Ocean for a chain of islands so small they barely registered on planetary maps, where two sides had fought with such ferocity over terrain of such limited strategic value that the only explanation was that neither of them had been capable of stopping once they'd started. He read about something called the Siege of Leningrad, where a human city had been surrounded, starved, shelled, and frozen for 900 days, and had not surrendered. His mandibles drew tighter. Back on the battle feed, the second Kreth destroyer was maneuvering to flank the relentless Accord while the first limped backward with its drive damaged. It was a textbook pincer. Any Council ship in that position would have been forced to split its defensive attention, weakening both arcs. The relentless Accord spun on its axis, a maneuver that technically exceeded the stress tolerances its hull class was rated for, and hit the flanking destroyer with its full broadside while keeping its point defense grid covering the previous arc. Something inside the human ship's structural frame screamed loudly enough that the sound sensors on nearby Council vessels picked it up. It didn't slow down. Captain Ose opened the Council frequency. Still calm. This is relentless Accord. We are engaging. If anyone in this fleet intends to actually do something today, now would be an excellent time. Velari Admiral Thesivar looked at her damaged, half-functional squadron. She looked at the battle map. She looked at the single white marker holding a position that her entire fleet had failed to hold. All Velari ships, she said quietly, advance. There is a specific psychological phenomenon that xenosociologists later termed combat dissonance shock, the moment when a species observing another species in battle first realizes that the enemy's concept of acceptable risk and their own concept of acceptable risk are operating on entirely different scales. It had been documented before, in various forms, in the Council's long history of interspecies contact. Nothing in those records had prepared anyone for watching a human crew fight. The relentless Accord had taken 11 direct hits in the first 20 minutes of engagement. 11. Any 3 of them, by Council damage assessment standards, should have caused the crew to initiate emergency withdrawal protocols. The 4th hit alone, a Kreth plasma lance that burned through the secondary hull plating on the ship's port side and caused a confirmed atmosphere breach in 2 compartments, would have legally justified full combat retreat under Council military law. The crew sealed the breached compartments in 4 minutes, then they kept fighting. The internal communications feed from the relentless Accord, captured by Council sensor arrays and later transcribed in full as a strategic document, read in places like it had been recorded on a different ship entirely, one that was not currently being shot at by a fleet of warships. Crew members called out damage reports in the same tone one might use to report a minor inconvenience. An engineer named Petrov was recorded saying, with genuine enthusiasm, that the plasma burn on Deck 7 had actually cleaned up some corrosion we'd been meaning to deal with. Someone in the fire control section, later identified as a weapons specialist named Chen, could be heard humming between target solutions. The council observers watching the feed were not sure what to do with this information. "Are they?" a Helvari general began. "Yes," said Sorvan without looking up from his file. "They do that." The Drayathi historian had, by this point, spent 40 minutes reading the deep historical records of human warfare, and he had arrived at a conclusion that he was not yet ready to share with the chamber, not because it wasn't clear, but because he was still processing the emotional weight of it. Humans were not, he had concluded, a species that was unusually brave. Bravery implied the presence of fear that had been overcome. What he was reading about, and what he was watching on the battle feed, seemed to be something functionally different. Humans under sufficient stress became focused. The fear did not disappear. Their physiological data confirmed it was present, but it seemed to get filed away somewhere, subordinated to the immediate problem with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. A human crew in a damaged ship being shot at by superior forces did not appear to experience this as a crisis to escape. They appeared to experience it as a problem to solve. And humans, every historical record confirmed, were pathologically committed to solving problems. He found an account of a naval battle from humanity's pre-spaceflight era, a place called the Coral Sea, fought on the surface of a liquid water ocean between two factions in a global war. A ship had been struck by multiple aerial weapons, was on fire, was listing severely, and was taking on water. Its crew had fought the damage for hours. When it became clear the ship could not be saved, the captain had ordered evacuation, but only after ensuring that every possible piece of useful equipment had been removed and transferred to other vessels first. The ship had eventually sunk. The crew had gone back to the fight the next day on different ships. Sorvan read 3 more accounts like this, then 5 more, then 10. He looked up at the battle feed. The Relentless Accord had just completed what the tactical analysts were calling an inverted pursuit arc. Essentially, it had allowed a Kreth destroyer to begin a chase maneuver, then reversed thrust so aggressively that it ended up behind the destroyer, in perfect firing position, before the Kreth helmsman had processed what had happened. The destroyer was now drifting with its engine core offline. Sorvan. It was Ambassador Lian Pham, Earth's Council representative, who had moved quietly to stand beside him during the battle. She was a small woman, middle-aged by human standards, with a calm face that had been doing a great deal of careful work in the last hour to not reveal what was happening underneath it. She nodded at his screen. "How far have you gotten?" "Far enough," he said. She nodded slowly, looking at the feed. "She'll hold," Pham said quietly. "Osai, she'll hold the line." "How do you know?" Ambassador Pham was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because she decided to, that's how it works with us." She paused. "Once one of ours decides, the math stops being the point." Sorvan looked back at his screen. He had just found an entry marked Chasen Reservoir. He began reading. On the battle feed, the Relentless Accord was burning. 3 separate sections of its hull were venting plasma. One of its railgun arrays had gone silent, either destroyed or out of ammunition. It had now been fighting continuously for 26 minutes against forces that should have killed it in 5. It had not slowed down. "Unbelievable," Admiral Sunvara whispered. "No," Sorvan said, and there was something heavy and strange in his voice. "That is exactly the problem. It is entirely believable. We simply forgot to believe it." Deep inside the Relentless Accord, in a space that the ship's schematics labeled main engineering but which the crew had, at some point in the vessel's 12-year service history, begun calling the pit, Chief Engineer Sergeant Amara Diallo was doing 3 things at once. She was directing a team of 6 to manually reroute the secondary power conduit that had been severed when Kreth fire burned through Deck 9. She was simultaneously monitoring the shield harmonics on a tablet strapped to her left forearm, watching for the specific frequency pattern she'd identified 40 minutes ago that seemed to precede every Kreth energy weapon discharge, by approximately 1.3 seconds, not long enough to dodge, but long enough to reinforce the right shield facings. And she was eating a protein bar, because she had not eaten since her shift started 6 hours ago, and her body had filed a complaint that she had decided to honor in the 30 seconds she had available. "Petrov," she called across the noise of the engineering bay. "Still alive," Petrov shouted back from inside a maintenance crawl space, his voice muffled by the bulkhead between them. "The bypass on grid 7 is pulling more current than it should. Because I bypassed it with a grid 7 conduit instead of a grid 9. "Why?" "Because the grid 9 conduit melted." "Can you compensate?" A pause, banging sounds. "Compensating now, it'll hold probably." "Probably is fine." This was not the kind of conversation that was supposed to happen on a warship, actively engaged in combat with a hostile fleet. According to Council military doctrine, this situation, a ship sustaining continuous fire, with multiple systems in emergency bypass, 2 hull breaches sealed with emergency foam rather than proper repair, and the chief engineer working from memory because the damage control AI had been knocked offline in the 6th hit, was defined as a Category 4 critical emergency requiring immediate withdrawal from the combat area. Sergeant Diallo had been informed of this doctrine during a joint Council-Terran training exercise 3 years ago. She had nodded politely and not mentioned that Category 4 critical emergency was roughly equivalent to what her crew called a Tuesday. The Relentless Accord had not been built for this specific battle. It had been built for deep patrol, long-range survey, and security operations in low-contact regions, a crew of 340 keeping the peace in areas too remote for larger fleet assets. Its armor was good but not exceptional. Its weapons were excellent but not overwhelming. What it had, in ways that didn't show up easily on specification sheets, was a crew that had been together for 4 years in the kinds of situations where improvisation, trust, and stubbornness were more valuable than any system in the hardware catalog. In the medical bay, Dr. Yuki Tanaka was treating 3 wounded crew members and simultaneously coaching a fire control technician named Akafor through a field-expedient repair on a targeting sensor that Tanaka had absolutely no technical training for, reading from the maintenance manual on her tablet while stitching a laceration with her other hand. When Akafor said, "I don't think this is working," Tanaka said, "Try it backwards." And when that worked, neither of them found it particularly remarkable. On the command deck, Captain Yara Osai stood at the center of controlled chaos with the particular stillness of someone who has been in enough chaos to know that stillness is itself a tool. She was 38 years old. She had taken her first command at 32, spent 4 years on the inner colonies patrol routes, and then volunteered for deep patrol specifically, because she preferred problems that required thinking over problems that could be solved by following a checklist. She was currently thinking very hard. The Kreth fleet had shifted its formation 12 minutes ago in a way that her tactical AI, before it took the hit that knocked it into safe mode, had flagged as a prelude to an encirclement attempt. She didn't need the AI to tell her that. She'd seen the formation shift in real time and had already started adjusting her positioning in response, feeding course corrections to her helmsman in a quiet, continuous stream that sounded, to outside observers, like someone directing traffic. "Helm, bring us 20 degrees starboard, half thrust." "20 starboard, half thrust, aye." "Weapons, I want the portside particle lance on the lead capital ship's engine cluster. Don't fire yet, just hold targeting." "Holding targeting on lead capital, engine cluster." "Chen, what's your count on the forward missile tubes?" 14 birds left, Captain, mixing warhead types." "Save 8. Fire 6 on the destroyer that's trying to get around our stern." 6 away." She watched the plot, watched the Kreth formation respond to the missile spread. They had to. It forced a defensive maneuver that opened a gap in their encirclement. Exactly the gap she needed for what she was planning in about 4 minutes, assuming Diallo got the power reroute finished in the pit. "Diallo," she said, touching her comm. "2 minutes, Captain. I need 90 seconds. A pause, then 90 seconds probably. That works." She looked back at the plot. The Velari squadron had entered the fight, Admiral Thesivar's ships, battered and undermanned, pushing forward with a determination that Osai respected enormously. They weren't in good shape, but they were here, and here mattered. She opened the council frequency. "Thesivar, when I make my next move, there's going to be a window on the Kreth left flank about 40 seconds. Take it." A brief pause. Then Thesivar's voice, steady despite everything, understood relentless accord. "We will be ready." In the council chamber, watching this exchange, the Helvari general who had laughed at Captain Osai's 60-second warning 40 minutes ago was sitting very quietly with his hands folded on the table in front of him. He did not speak. He was watching a human crew fight at a level of coherent function under catastrophic conditions that his species' entire military psychology framework had no vocabulary for, and he was doing something that Helvari generals very rarely did. He was reconsidering things. War Master Guveth had not been surprised by an enemy in 22 years of active command. He was surprised now. He sat in the command throne of the Eternal Dominion, flagship of the Kreth Advance Fleet, a vessel so massive it generated its own minor gravitational field, and stared at the battle data with the expression of a mathematician who has found an error in a proof he was absolutely certain was correct. Around him, his bridge crew worked in the focused, disciplined silence that was the hallmark of Kreth military professionalism. Nobody spoke unless they had something of direct tactical relevance to say. Nobody showed uncertainty. These were the rules. Guveth was privately, profoundly uncertain, and he was keeping it off his face with significant effort. The anomaly, he had begun thinking of the human ship as the anomaly, because his tactical systems had no better category for it, had been in the fight for 31 minutes. By the War Master's own pre-battle projections, any single hostile vessel of that class, facing those odds, should have either been destroyed or retreated within the first 8 minutes. This was not pessimism or optimism. It was mathematics, derived from thousands of engagements across 2 centuries of Kreth military history. Ships had limits, physics had rules, combat followed predictable patterns. The anomaly had not read the projections. "Damage assessment," Guveth said quietly. His tactical officer, Commander Vreth, turned from her station. There was something in her face that Guveth recognized and did not like. It was the specific tension of an officer who has run the numbers multiple times and keeps getting an answer that doesn't make sense. 3 destroyers mission killed, War Master. 2 more at reduced combat effectiveness. The capital ship Voreth's Blade is reporting shield degradation on its engine section from a targeting sequence we have no record of in any database. The sequence that hit the same junction 3 times from 3 angles. "Yes, War Master. Our tactical AI has analyzed it. The firing solution required simultaneous coordination between at least 4 separate weapon systems with a response window of under 2 seconds. Our models indicate this is not possible for a crew of that size without full AI integration." "And their AI?" Vreth hesitated. "Intelligence believes their combat AI went offline approximately 19 minutes ago. Sensor data supports this. We detected a system reboot signature consistent with AI safe mode shutdown." Guveth was quiet for a moment. "So they have been doing this manually for the last 19 minutes. That is what the data indicates, War Master." He turned back to the battle feed. The anomaly was still fighting, still adapting. Every Kreth formation shift, every tactical maneuver was being countered with what his analysts had now identified as a pattern. The human ship was not just reacting, it was anticipating. As if the human commander on the other side of the battlefield could see the intent behind the movement before the movement completed. Pull the intelligence file on humanity, Guveth said. There was a pause. Then his intelligence officer said carefully, the file is limited, War Master. Humanity is a relatively young spacefaring species. There have been few direct contact engagements. The file is. Pull it anyway. The file appeared on his secondary screen. Guveth read through it quickly. It was, as his officer had indicated, thin. Earth was a single-system species barely 2 centuries out from its home world. No significant wars of note in the interstellar record. They had apparently been peaceful, or at least contained, since achieving faster-than-light capability. But there was an attachment. A flag in the file from a Drayathi cultural observer, appended 20 years ago, tagged Advisory Historical Context. He opened it, he read it. It was not long, but one paragraph near the end stopped him entirely, and he read it twice. Human military history, pre-spaceflight, represents the most continuous, varied, and extensively documented record of organized armed conflict of any known species. They fought for resources, ideology, territory, and at times for reasons that our historians still cannot fully categorize. What is consistent across thousands of years of this record is the following. A human force that has committed to the defense of something, a position, a people, a principle, does not disengage. This is not courage as other species understand it. It is closer to a psychological lock state. They will absorb losses that would cause any rational actor to withdraw, and they will continue to function, adapt, and fight with what remains. The correct strategic response to encountering a human force in this state is avoidance. Engagement should only be initiated if annihilation is achievable in the first strike. If the first strike fails, withdraw. Guveth looked at the date on the attachment, 20 years ago. He looked at the battle feed. The anomaly, the relentless Accord, was still fighting. It had been hit 17 times now. It had lost at least 2 weapon systems. Part of its hull was venting gas, and it was currently in the process of executing a maneuver that his tactical team had not seen before, something that looked geometrically impossible for a ship of its size, turning inside its own length in a way that was definitely stressing its structural frame beyond rated tolerances. If the first strike fails, withdraw. They had not achieved annihilation in the first strike. They had not achieved it in the 17th strike. All advance units, Guveth said quietly. Hold current positions, do not advance, do not engage. His bridge crew looked at him. This was not a standard order. War Master, Commander Vreth said carefully. I said hold. He kept his eyes on the battle feed. I need to think. The political arguments started, as political arguments in the Galactic Council often did, approximately 4 minutes after it became clear that the immediate crisis was not going to result in everyone dying. Ambassador Keth of the Helvari Concordat spoke first, which was traditional, since the Helvari had the loudest voices both literally and institutionally. He was a large being, broad-shouldered, with a resonant baritone that had ended careers and launched initiatives in equal measure across 40 years of council diplomacy. When he spoke, rooms tended to listen. I must raise a formal concern, he said, rising from his seat with the particular deliberateness of someone who has prepared a speech and intends to deliver it.